Did you see that shit? MMA podcast. Hosted by mixed martial arts journalist Mike Strauss, aka Strauss21, and Chicago's number one underground comedian, Apollo Taj Mahal.
Thank you for listening. I am Mike Strauss, aka Strauss21, with Chicago's number one underground comedian, Apollo Taj Mahal. We appreciate it, guys. If you like the interview, and I know you will, be sure to go ahead and listen to the full episode. You can find it on our website, didyousseethatshit.com, YouTube, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, pretty much wherever you find your favorite podcast. Be sure to listen to the whole episode. We appreciate it very much, guys. So I want to introduce Mike Dyce. He, of course, is with SI and Fansided, and Mike always has the scoop. What's going on, Mike?
Not much. How are you doing?
Doing good, man. I appreciate you taking some time with me today. I know that you're a busy guy, and, speaking of busy, in the last, 24 hours or so, the UFC has announced or booked like 11 or so fights, man. What do you make of this recent barrage of fight announcements?
I think given the circumstances surrounding UFC 222, it's kind of a little over sensationalized. It seems like they always kind of book in spurts like this. They'll schedule out kind of like a quarter of events or a year, half a year of events, and then it seems like a bunch of fight announcements kind of come really quickly in rapid succession. I just think the situation surrounding UFC 222 and Max Holloway being injured kind of exacerbated that because the status of that card was up in the air. So I don't know that it necessarily catches me off guard. And then, of course, once they figured out that domino, it kind of allowed other dominoes to follow suit, which is why you hear, Cyborg steps in to save UFC 222. Now all of a sudden Amanda Nunes is freed. And that's why we have a Raquel Pennington conversation surrounding UFC 224 in Brazil is happening. Once the first domino falls, the other things kind of seem to fall into place. And I think that kind of facilitates these rapid fighter agreements or fights being announced.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I think it makes sense. I mean, you get the first thing in place and then it all kind of falls into place. It makes a lot of sense there, Mike. You mentioned Cyborg stepping in to kind of save the day at 222. The casual fan is probably not very familiar with Kunitsaya. What can you tell us about her?
She's a bantamweight, which I think is the kind of thing that's going to stick out right away, is that Cyborg's been clamoring for wanting to build out this featherweight division. And I mean, she's fought at featherweight before, but I think she's known primarily as a bantamweight. And I think that's kind of the frustrating part that it's going to be for fans once again, is I think once the promotion kind of happens, and, as the card draws near, it's Cyborg fighting another bantamweight. And I think it's going to ultimately be whether or not fans are interested in seeing Cyborg potentially run through someone really quickly again. It's a kind of the Ronda Rousey, Mike Tyson effect, where people want to see people lose really quickly. But it keeps the thing on. I think in that card in particular, the Brian Ortega and the Frankie Edgar fight is going to be the really interesting one to watch.
Yes, that's a really fun fight. Now, what do you think of that? I mean, is Frankie this guy who is kind of been the guy that is in charge, I guess, of turning back these like Yair Rodriguez, and he's done it with a handful of guys. Is Ortega that next guy he turns back, or do you think Ortega is the guy that can kind of figure out Frankie Edgar?
That's the you summed up basically Frankie Edgar's career right there. Especially particularly at featherweight, it seems like he gets into the title mix, he gets a title shot, he doesn't win or something happens, and then he ends up fighting, the top contenders or guys who could eventually fight for the title, and he ends up turning them away again quickly. And so, it's interesting to see what happens. Every time it seems like they book one of these, you mentioned Yair Rodriguez for one, that it's kind of, is this guy going to be the guy who stops Frankie Edgar? And Brian Ortega, for everything that's great about him, he doesn't have necessarily the experience that Frankie Edgar has. But eventually Frankie Edgar, Father Time's going to catch up with him, and then that becomes a factor. And it doesn't look like Frankie Edgar is at that point yet. So I don't think that Brian Ortega is necessarily a given to challenge Frankie Edgar for it. But it's foolish at this point to think that Brian Ortega can stop Frankie Edgar. But of course, we saw Brian Ortega in his last fight with some very slick submission work, being able to do a whole lot of things. I don't know if Frankie Edgar, for all his wrestling accolades, can adapt to that. But, I think going into it, you have to think Frankie Edgar is the favorite.
Yeah, I agree. Frankie is just one of my favorite fighters. He's just a fun guy to watch fight. He's a guy that people want to root for. A fight that really doesn't make much sense, but it's kind of gaining some traction, man, is the Diaz-Woodley fight. Is this going to happen?
Dana White came out and said it's not going to happen. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it won't happen, as we all know. But, Diaz wants the fight. Woodley wants the fight. Why not? The UFC Chicago card's right there. They don't have anybody to headline that card. You have two All the other pay-per-views coming up, 224, which they announced like last weekend, they doesn't necessarily have a date or a main event, but it seems like Amanda Nunes as a Brazilian champion is kind of pegged to fill that role. People thought that was going to be when she fights Cyborg. So Chicago, you don't have necessarily a huge heavyweight champion star to headline that card with some kind of connection to the city outside of Woodley. Woodley trains in Milwaukee. He lives in St. Louis. He kind of bookends the city on major sides from their next biggest city. So it makes sense to have Woodley on that card. And if Nate Diaz is the fight that's going to happen, or if that's the fight that he wants, then why not steer into that? The other thing, too, is that the Chicago cards in the UFC have traditionally been a hard sell. When they had the on Fox ones in back-to-back Julys with Dillashaw Barao 2, and then the following year with Holm Shevchenko, they weren't sellouts. Granted, it was in July, and it can be really hot and humid in July in Chicago, so it can be unpleasant. And then before that, they were doing events in January. And living in Chicago, we know that January is not exactly a time. It doesn't necessarily deter Chicago natives, but it doesn't necessarily encourage them to get out either. So moving it up in June a little bit, the weather should be a little bit nicer. But Woodley, I think, is a big draw to put on that card. And if the Diaz fight, if you add Diaz, that's another compelling star. And I think that'll intrigue fans. And I think that could be the kind of turning point for UFC events in Chicago. Woodley by himself might run into the same problems that Dillashaw Barao did and that was a title fight, even though it was on Fox. Woodley there by himself might run into those same issues, but you add the Diaz element to it, that I think takes it over the top and can kind of salvage the Chicago, which is a major market for the UFC.
Man, you just about said it all right there. Of course, I'm in Chicago, and I would love nothing more to have, Diaz Woodley here. I was going to ask you about the Chicago card because it's the first ever pay-per-view that they're doing here. And I was hoping we were going to get more than just CM Punk, So yeah. Woodley Diaz would be the fight. Turning to this weekend, though, man, UFC 221, a lot of people are saying this is the worst pay-per-view in history. Would you go that far?
No. UFC 208 wasn't that long ago, lest we forget. That was, of course, when Holm fought Jermaine Durandamy for the inaugural featherweight champion. Of course, Jermaine won and then got stripped. I mean, that card was a less than stellar card, and I think it was, Anderson Silva was on that card, and he fought Derek Brunson, and he won, and it was controversial. So, I wouldn't go as far as saying that this is the worst card ever. It's definitely super top heavy. Like Luke Rockhold. If you compare the cards side by side, Luke Rockhold versus Yoel Romero that's a matchup that I think all MMA fans want to see. And it's for an interim title. It sucks that it's not Robert Whittaker, but I think that's intriguing and it can kind of balance out. It's definitely top heavy, and the rest of the pay-per-view card isn't something to necessarily aspire to, but it's better than other cards they've had. It's not the greatest card. It's not an average pay-per-view card either, but it's definitely not the worst.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it too. The Luke Rockhold and Romero fight, that's one of the 2 or 3 best fights you can make in the middleweight division. And the Curtis Blades Mark Hunt fight, that has a lot of intrigue to me as well too. Other than that, I could maybe take it or leave it. But let me ask you, if you're speaking to the hardcore fans and you're kind of looking up and down at this weekend's card, what's a fight that you would say maybe isn't getting the publicity it should, but we should kind of keep an eye out for?
You just mentioned the Mark Hunt versus Curtis Blades fight, and Curtis Blades is a guy who's from Chicago who could very well end up on that Chicago pay-per-view too, depending on how it comes out of this. But, it's crazy to think the selling point of this fight in Australia was Robert Whittaker fighting on this card. And then you have Mark Hunt on the card, and it seems like he's been hardly promoted and discussed at all. So much focus is centered around Rockhold and Yoel Romero at the top. But Curtis Blades is also a guy who's only ever lost once in the UFC, and it was to Francis Ngannou. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was like a doctor stoppage between rounds. Like, he didn't get knocked out. Like, the doctor stopped the fight. And up until the Stipe Miocic fight, that was the toughest fight Francis Ngannou had, was against Curtis Blades. And he's got a wrestling background. He's going against Mark Hunt. And Mark Hunt's always said he wants clean fighters, and Curtis Blades appears to be, by all means, clean. So it's an intriguing matchup, and maybe this is like a residual from his feuds with the UFC Mark Hunt over all the PED users who fought the Alistair Overeems and the Brock Lesnar's and stuff. So maybe that's why it's under promoted. But I think that's one is certainly to keep your eye on. Otherwise, there's intriguing local talent, and that's what they do on these cards. And I think as a hardcore fan, if you want to sell it to them, it's just a chance to see a lot of up and coming guys who you don't see that often, or are kind of under the radar, and you have that kind of knowledge to be ahead of the step of other MMA fans when they finally get that push. I wish Dan Hooker was on this card. I think that would have been a really intriguing matchup. But, like Ross Pearson's on this card. That's an intriguing, person to watch. He struggled, but you could say he's fighting for his UFC career. There's intriguing matchups, but
Absolutely. I agree with you, man. The Curtis Blades fight. Man, if only they would have been able to get Hooker. I don't know if he's injured or what, but Hooker, man, in his last outing against Pearson that you mentioned, he looked phenomenal. I mean, Hooker looks like he could be the next guy from that geographical area to take that step.
Yeah, and I remember when he was at UFC 192, fighting at UFC 192 in Houston. That was the Daniel Cormier Alexander Gustafsson card. He was sitting at media day, and like nobody was talking to Danny Hooker. He was just sitting there by himself. Nobody, he was a relative newcomer. Of course, you're at the media day, and there's like big names like Juliana Pena was there, and all these other people. Daniel Cormier, for instance, and Alexander Gustafsson. So he's kind of overlooked, but. To see his rise, I think he would have been a really intriguing person to have on the card. But things don't always work out.
Absolutely. Well, Mike, I know after listening, everybody's going to want to, if they don't already, everybody's going to want to follow you on social media. How can everybody find you?
It's easy. Mike Dyce, basically all social media accounts, DYCE.
Very good. I like to keep it easy too. It's just not so much for everybody, but for me,
Right. Exactly.
I appreciate it, Mike. Anything else you'd like to add?
Just thank you for having me on the show. I really appreciate you thinking of me and inviting me to come on. I enjoyed talking to you.
Absolutely, man. I think you're absolutely one of the best in the business, and I'd love to have you on again.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Take care, Mike.
You too.